Margaret Williams stood outside the huge iron gates of the Blackwood mansion. Her hand shook a little as she held her small bag. The morning sun made the big house look like a castle from a fairy tale. But Margaret was not a princess. She was just a woman who needed a job badly. The gates opened slowly. Margaret walked up the long stone path. Her shoes made soft sounds on the ground. On both sides of the path there were perfect gardens with flowers of every color. The grass looked like green carpet. Everything was so clean and beautiful. Margaret had never seen anything like it. The house was 3 stories tall and made of white stone. Big windows sparkled in the sunlight. There were columns at the front like an old Greek temple. Margaret counted 12 windows just on the front of the house. She wondered how many rooms were inside. A tall man in a black suit opened the front door before Margaret could knock. He looked at her from head to toe. His face showed no emotion. "You must be the new housekeeper," he said in a cold voice. "I am James, the butler. Follow me." Margaret followed James inside. Her mouth fell open. The entrance hall was bigger than her whole apartment back in the city. The ceiling was so high she had to bend her neck back to see it. A huge chandelier hung down with hundreds of crystals that caught the light like diamonds. But what caught Margaret's eye the most was the piano. It stood in the corner like a sleeping giant. It was black and shiny, and Margaret could tell it was very expensive. A white cloth covered the keys. She wondered if anyone played it. "Do not touch anything unless you are cleaning it," James said, sharply. He had seen her looking at the piano. Mrs. Blackwood has very strict rules about her things. James led Margaret through room after room. Each one was more beautiful than the last. There was a dining room with a table that could seat 20 people. The living room had furniture that looked like it belonged in a museum. Paintings hung on every wall. Margaret recognized some famous artists' work. "Mrs. Blackwood will see you in the morning room," James said. He stopped at a door and knocked 3 times. "Come in," called a voice from inside. Margaret entered the room. Mrs. Victoria Blackwood sat in a high-backed chair like a queen on her throne. She was a woman in her 50s with gray hair pulled back tight. She wore a dark blue dress with pearls around her neck. Her eyes were sharp and cold like winter ice. "So you are Margaret Williams," Mrs. Blackwood said. She did not smile. "I hope you understand that this is a very important household. I expect perfect work and no mistakes." "Yes, ma'am," Margaret said quietly. "You will clean the house every day. You will cook simple meals. You will do laundry and iron clothes. You will work 6 days a week. Sunday is your day off. But you must still be quiet and stay out of the way." Mrs. Blackwood stood up and walked around Margaret like she was examining a horse. "You will not go into my son's room unless he asks you to clean it. You will not touch my personal things, and you will remember that you are the help. You are not family. You are not a friend. You work here." Margaret nodded. She needed this job badly. She had been out of work for 2 months. The money from her last job was almost gone. "The pay is $800 a month plus a room and food," Mrs. Blackwood said. "If you work well, you can stay. If you cause problems, you will leave immediately. Do you understand?" "Yes, ma'am, I understand." Mrs. Blackwood rang a small bell. James appeared right away. "Show her to her room," Mrs. Blackwood said. "She starts work tomorrow morning at 6 o'clock. Margaret's room was small but clean. It was on the 3rd floor with the other workers' rooms. There was a bed, a desk, and a small closet. The window looked out over the gardens. It was better than many places Margaret had lived. That evening, Margaret walked through the house to learn where everything was. The kitchen was huge with 2 ovens and a big refrigerator. There were pots and pans everywhere. The pantry was full of expensive food. As she walked back through the main hall, Margaret stopped at the piano again. She lifted the white cloth just a little and saw the beautiful black and white keys. They were perfectly clean. She wondered when someone had last played it. "Beautiful, isn't it?" said a voice behind her. Margaret jumped and turned around. A young man about 30 years old stood there. He had dark hair and kind eyes. He wore an expensive suit, but his smile was warm. "I'm sorry," Margaret said quickly. "I wasn't going to touch it." The man laughed. "It's okay, I'm Christopher Blackwood. You must be Margaret, our new housekeeper." Margaret felt her face get red. This was Mrs. Blackwood's son. She was talking to the son of the house like they were equals. "Yes, sir. I'm sorry if I was somewhere I shouldn't be. Please don't call me sir. Just Christopher is fine." He walked over to the piano and touched the keys gently. "My father loved this piano. He played it every evening after dinner. My mother hasn't touched it since he died 5 years ago." "It must be very special," Margaret said. "It is. It's a Steinway grand piano. Very old and very valuable. My father said it had the most beautiful sound in the world." Christopher looked sad for a moment. "Do you play piano, Margaret?" Margaret's heart jumped. She wanted to say yes. She wanted to tell him about all the years she had studied piano, about the competitions she had won, about the dreams she once had. But she remembered Mrs. Blackwood's words about knowing her place. "No, sir. I mean, Christopher, I don't play piano." Christopher nodded. "Well, maybe someday someone will play it again. It seems lonely just sitting there." Margaret went to bed that night thinking about the piano. She dreamed about playing it. In her dream, the house was full of beautiful music, but when she woke up, she remembered that she was just the housekeeper. She was there to clean and cook, not to make music. The next morning started very early. Margaret got up at 5:30 to be ready for work at 6. Mrs. Blackwood gave her a long list of things to do: clean the bathrooms, dust all the furniture, wash the windows, cook lunch. Do laundry. Margaret worked hard all day. She wanted to do a good job. She needed this work. Every time she walked through the main hall, she looked at the piano. It seemed to call to her, but she remembered what James had said about not touching anything. By evening, Margaret was very tired. Her back hurt from bending and cleaning. Her hands were red from washing dishes, but she had finished everything on Mrs. Blackwood's list. As she walked to her room, Margaret heard Mrs. Blackwood talking to someone on the phone in the living room. "Yes, Margaret seems to work hard," Mrs. Blackwood was saying. "She knows her place, which is good. I can't stand help who think they are better than they are. This one understands that she is here to work, not to be friends or family." Margaret felt sad hearing these words, but she knew Mrs. Blackwood was right. She was just the housekeeper, nothing more. She went to sleep thinking about the piano and wondering if she would ever play music again. 2 weeks had passed since Margaret started working at the Blackwood mansion. She had learned the daily routine well. Every morning she cleaned the house from top to bottom. Every afternoon she cooked and served meals. Every evening she did laundry and prepared for the next day. Margaret was a good worker. She was quiet and did her job without complaints. Mrs. Blackwood seemed happy with her work, though she never said so directly. James, the butler, had stopped watching Margaret so closely. Even the other workers accepted her as part of the team. Friday evening, Mrs. Blackwood told Margaret that she would have a dinner party on Saturday night. 10 of her closest friends would come for dinner and drinks. Margaret would need to clean the house extra well and help cook a special meal. "This is a very important dinner," Mrs. Blackwood said. "My friends are all from the best families in the city. Everything must be perfect. I will not accept any mistakes." Margaret worked all day Saturday to get ready. She polished every piece of silver until it shined like mirrors. She cleaned the crystal glasses until they sparkled. She dusted every surface twice. The cook, Mrs. Patterson, made a wonderful meal of roast beef, vegetables, and fancy desserts. At 7 o'clock, the guests began to arrive. Margaret watched from the kitchen as expensive cars pulled up to the house. The women wore beautiful dresses and jewelry. The men wore dark suits. They all looked like they had never worried about money in their lives. Margaret's job was to serve drinks and help Mrs. Patterson serve dinner. She put on her best black dress and white apron. Mrs. Blackwood had told her to be invisible. Serve the food and drinks, but don't speak unless someone asked her a direct question. The dinner party was in the big dining room. The long table was set with the best china and crystal. Candles burned in tall silver holders. Fresh flowers sat in the center of the table. Everything looked perfect. Margaret served drinks as the guests talked and laughed. They spoke about their trips to Europe, their expensive cars, and their children who went to private schools. Margaret listened but said nothing. "Victoria," said a woman with white hair and too much makeup, "when are you going to find a wife for Christopher? He's 30 years old and still single." Mrs. Blackwood sighed deeply. "Don't remind me, Eleanor. I've introduced him to every suitable young woman in the city, but he says none of them interest him." "What kind of woman does he want?" asked a man with a thick mustache. "That's the problem," Mrs. Blackwood said. "He has impossible standards. He wants someone who is beautiful, educated, and talented. But not just any talents. He wants someone who can appreciate art and music. Someone with culture." The guests nodded, as if this made perfect sense. Margaret poured wine into their glasses and tried not to listen, but their words made her think of her old life, the life she had before everything went wrong. "Have you tried the Morrison girl?" asked another woman. "She's very pretty and she went to college." "Yes, but she can barely read a book, let alone discuss art," Mrs. Blackwood said with a sniff. "Christopher needs someone who can match his intelligence." "What about music?" asked Eleanor. "Christopher loves classical music. Maybe he needs a woman who can play piano." Mrs. Blackwood laughed, but it was not a happy sound. "That would be wonderful. But do you know how hard it is to find a woman who can really play piano well? Not just simple songs, but real music. Classical music." "Surely there are music teachers," said the man with the mustache. "Teachers, yes. But I'm not talking about someone who gives lessons to children. I mean someone who can play like a real artist. Someone who understands music in their soul." Margaret almost dropped the wine bottle she was holding. Mrs. Blackwood was describing exactly what Margaret used to be. But that was in the past. That was before her world fell apart. Mrs. Blackwood stood up and walked to the window that looked out at the main hall. She could see the piano from there. "You see that piano?" she said to her guests. "It was my husband's most precious possession. He paid $50,000 for it 20 years ago. It's a 1925 Steinway grand piano, one of the finest ever made." The guests turned to look where she was pointing. They all made impressed sounds. "My husband could play it beautifully," Mrs. Blackwood continued. "Every evening he would sit at that piano and fill this house with the most wonderful music. He said that piano had magic in it, that it could only be played properly by someone with a true gift." "It's beautiful," said Eleanor. "Does anyone play it now?" Mrs. Blackwood's face became sad for a moment. Then she lifted her chin proudly. "No one has touched it since my husband died. I've had it tuned every 6 months, but it sits silent." She walked back to the table and sat down. Her eyes had a strange light in them. "You know what?" she said suddenly. "If I could find a woman who could truly master that piano, I would consider her worthy of my son." The room became very quiet. Margaret felt her heart start to beat fast. "What do you mean, Victoria?" asked Eleanor. Mrs. Blackwood smiled, but it was a cold smile. "I mean exactly what I said. If any woman could sit at that piano and play it like my husband did, with real skill and real feeling, she would prove herself worthy of marrying Christopher." The guests began to talk all at once. Some thought it was a wonderful idea. Others thought it was impossible. "But Victoria," said a younger woman, "what if some woman actually could play that well? Would you really let Christopher marry her?" Mrs. Blackwood laughed loudly. "Of course, but don't worry about that. Do you know how rare real piano talent is? Especially among the kind of women who would be suitable for Christopher. What if she was beautiful and could play but came from a poor family?" asked the man with the mustache. Mrs. Blackwood thought about this for a moment. If she had true talent, real education, and proper manners, I suppose her family background wouldn't matter. After all, my husband always said that real art comes from the soul, not from money. Margaret stood in the corner of the room holding an empty wine bottle. Her hands were shaking. She could not believe what she was hearing. "So you're saying," said Eleanor slowly, That any woman who can play that piano like a true artist would be worthy of marrying your son, even if she wasn't from a wealthy family? That's exactly what I'm saying, Mrs. Blackwood said firmly. But it will never happen. Real piano talent like that is so rare, and the kind of woman who has it would never be interested in Christopher anyway. She would probably be famous already. The guests all laughed. They thought Mrs. Blackwood was being clever and funny. It's like a fairy tale, said one of the women. The magic piano that can only be played by the right person. Exactly, said Mrs. Blackwood. And just like in fairy tales, it will never really happen. Margaret quietly left the dining room and went to the kitchen. Her hands were still shaking. Mrs. Patterson looked at her with worry. Are you feeling all right, dear? The cook asked. I'm fine, Margaret said. But she was not fine. Her mind was spinning with thoughts she had tried to forget. For the rest of the evening, Margaret served food and cleaned dishes, but she could not stop thinking about what Mrs. Blackwood had said. Every time she walked through the main hall, she looked at the piano. She remembered how it felt to have her fingers on piano keys. She remembered the joy of making music. After the guests left and the house was quiet, Margaret lay in her small bed and stared at the ceiling. Mrs. Blackwood had made a promise in front of 10 witnesses. She had said that any woman who could truly play that piano would be worthy of her son. Margaret knew she could play that piano. She had been playing piano since she was 5 years old. She had won competitions. She had studied with the best teachers. Before her life fell apart, people had said she had a gift. But she was just the housekeeper now. Mrs. Blackwood would never take her seriously. She would laugh at the idea that the help could play piano like an artist. Still, Margaret could not stop thinking about it. For the first time in years, she felt a tiny spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, there was still magic left in music. 3 days had passed since the dinner party, but Margaret could not stop thinking about Mrs. Blackwood's words. Every time she walked through the main hall, the piano seemed to call to her. She found herself slowing down when she dusted nearby. Looking at the keys hidden under the white cloth, Margaret tried to push the thoughts away. She told herself it was foolish to dream. She was the housekeeper, nothing more. But late at night, lying in her small bed, she remembered how it felt to make music. Her fingers would move on the blanket as if she was playing piano keys. On Tuesday evening, Mrs. Blackwood announced that she would be going to the city for 2 days to visit her sister. Christopher was away on a business trip and would not return until Thursday. The house would be very quiet. James will be in charge while I'm gone, Mrs. Blackwood told Margaret. You will continue your regular work. Mrs. Patterson will cook simple meals for the staff. I expect everything to be perfect when I return. Margaret nodded. Yes, ma'am. Wednesday morning came and went quietly. Margaret cleaned the house as usual. She cooked lunch for herself and the other workers. In the afternoon, James told her that he would be visiting his brother in town and would not return until late evening. Mrs. Patterson had finished cooking dinner and gone to visit her daughter. By 6 o'clock, Margaret was alone in the big house. The silence felt strange. Margaret was used to hearing voices and footsteps. Now there was nothing but the sound of her own breathing and the tick of the old grandfather clock in the hall. Margaret finished her evening work early. She washed the last dishes and put them away. She swept the kitchen floor and turned off all the lights. As she walked through the main hall toward the stairs, she stopped at the piano. Her heart was beating fast. She looked around to make sure she was really alone. Then, very slowly, she lifted the white cloth and folded it carefully. The piano keys seemed to glow in the soft light from the hall chandelier. Black and white keys in perfect rows. Margaret remembered exactly how they felt under her fingers, smooth and cool and full of possibility. She sat down on the piano bench. It was the perfect height, just like the bench she had used when she was studying music. She placed her hands above the keys but did not touch them yet. Margaret closed her eyes and took a deep breath. She thought about her father who had first taught her to play when she was 5 years old. She remembered her teacher, Mrs. Chen, who had said Margaret had natural talent. She thought about all the hours she had practiced, all the competitions she had won, all the dreams she had once had. Slowly, Margaret placed her fingers on the keys and began to play. The first notes were soft and gentle, a simple melody from a piece by Chopin that she had learned as a teenager. But as her fingers remembered the movement, the music became stronger and more confident. Margaret played the entire piece without looking at the keys. Her fingers knew exactly where to go. The piano responded beautifully, each note clear and tch. She had been right about this instrument. It was special. When the Chopin piece ended, Margaret moved to something more difficult, a piece by Rachmaninoff that required fast finger work and strong emotion. Her hands moved across the keys like dancers. The music filled the big hall and echoed through the empty house. Margaret felt tears on her face, but she did not stop playing. It had been 3 years since she had touched a piano, 3 years since she had made music. She had forgotten how much she loved it, how much it was part of who she was. She played piece after piece. Mozart, Beethoven, Debussy, Bach. Her fingers remembered everything. The years of practice came flooding back. It was as if she had never stopped playing. The music was sometimes soft and gentle, sometimes strong and dramatic. Margaret played with her whole heart. She forgot about being the housekeeper. She forgot about Mrs. Blackwood's rules. She was just Margaret Williams, the girl who had once dreamed of being a concert pianist. Unknown to Margaret, Christopher Blackwood had returned early from his business trip. His meetings had finished a day sooner than expected, and he had decided to come home instead of staying in a hotel. He parked his car quietly in the driveway, not wanting to wake anyone if they were sleeping. As Christopher walked toward the front door, he heard something that made him stop. Music. Beautiful, incredible music was coming from inside the house. He knew it was coming from his father's piano. Christopher stood frozen on the front steps. Who was playing? His mother was away. James was visiting his brother. Mrs. Patterson couldn't play piano. The only person in the house should be Margaret, the housekeeper. But whoever was playing was amazing. Christopher had heard many professional pianists in concert halls. This person was as good as any of them, maybe better. Christopher quietly opened the front door and stepped inside. The music was even more beautiful from inside the house. He could see someone sitting at the piano, but the hall light was dim and he couldn't see who it was. The person at the piano was playing a piece by Liszt now. It was very difficult music that required years of training to play well. Christopher moved closer, staying in the shadows. When he got close enough to see clearly, Christopher could not believe his eyes. It was Margaret, the quiet housekeeper who had said she didn't play piano. But she was playing like a master. Margaret's face was peaceful and happy as she played. Her fingers moved with perfect control. Her whole body moved with the rhythm of the music. Christopher could see that this was not just someone who had learned a few songs. This was a real pianist. The Liszt piece came to an end and Margaret began something new. It was a piece Christopher recognized but had never heard played so beautifully. The melody was sad and sweet at the same time. It made Christopher think of his father and how much he had loved music. Christopher stood perfectly still, afraid to make any sound. He did not want this magical moment to end. He watched Margaret play for nearly an hour. Every piece was perfect. Every note was exactly right. Finally, Margaret played one last piece. It was a gentle lullaby that seemed to float through the air like a soft wind. When the last note faded away, she sat quietly for a moment, with her hands still on the keys. Christopher saw Margaret wipe tears from her eyes. Then she carefully placed the white cloth back over the piano keys. She stood up slowly as if she was waking up from a beautiful dream. Christopher quickly stepped back into the shadows. He did not want Margaret to know he had been watching. She needed to think her secret was still safe. Margaret walked slowly toward the stairs, her face still glowing with happiness from the music. Christopher waited until he heard her bedroom door close on the 3rd floor. Then he walked to the piano and lifted the cloth. The keys were still warm from Margaret's fingers. Christopher touched them gently and smiled. His father had always said this piano had magic in it. Tonight, Christopher had seen that magic come alive. Christopher went to his room but could not sleep. His mind was full of questions. How had Margaret learned to play so well? Why had she lied about not playing piano? What was her story? One thing, Christopher knew for certain. He had just heard the most beautiful piano playing of his life, and it had come from the quiet woman who cleaned his house and cooked his meals. Margaret also could not sleep. She lay in her bed feeling happy and sad at the same time. Happy because she had remembered how much she loved music. Sad because it was just a dream. Tomorrow she would go back to being the housekeeper who was not supposed to touch the piano. But for one magical evening, Margaret had been herself again. She had been the pianist she was born to be, and nothing could take that memory away from her. Outside, the night was quiet except for the sound of wind in the trees. The big house held its secrets, and the piano waited under its white cloth for the next time music would fill the empty halls. Thursday morning came too soon for Margaret. She woke up feeling like she was still in a dream. The memory of playing the piano felt so real and so wonderful that she almost believed it had been just her imagination. But her fingers still remembered the feel of the keys. Margaret got dressed and went downstairs to start her morning work. The house felt different now. Every time she looked at the piano, she remembered the music that had filled the halls. She tried to act normal, but inside, her heart was singing. Mrs. Blackwood returned from the city in the afternoon. She was in a bad mood because her train had been late. She complained about everything: the dust on the tables, the way Margaret had folded the towels, the temperature of her tea. "I expect better work than this," Mrs. Blackwood said sharply. "Just because I was away doesn't mean you can be lazy." "I'm sorry, ma'am," Margaret said quietly. "I'll do better." Christopher returned from his business trip that evening. At dinner, he kept looking at Margaret in a new way. When she served his soup, he said, "Thank you," very politely. When she brought his coffee, he smiled at her. Margaret thought he was just being kind. But Christopher was thinking about the beautiful music he had heard. Every time he looked at Margaret, he remembered her playing the piano like an angel. He wanted to ask her about it, but he didn't know how to begin. After dinner, Christopher went to his room to unpack. Margaret cleaned the kitchen and dining room. When she was done, she walked through the main hall to go upstairs. She stopped at the piano, just like she did every evening now. Margaret looked around to make sure she was alone. Then she lifted the corner of the white cloth just enough to see a few keys. She touched one key very softly. It made a quiet, sweet sound. "What do you think you're doing?" Margaret jumped and spun around. Mrs. Blackwood stood in the doorway with her arms crossed. Her face was angry and cold. I was just dusting," Margaret said quickly. She dropped the cloth and stepped back from the piano. "Dusting?" Mrs. Blackwood walked toward Margaret slowly, like a cat stalking a mouse. "With your finger on the keys?" Margaret felt her face turn red. "I'm sorry, ma'am. I just wanted to see if it was clean under the cloth." Mrs. Blackwood reached the piano and looked at it carefully. "This piano is not part of your cleaning duties. James takes care of it. You have no business touching it." "Yes, ma'am, I understand. It won't happen again." But Mrs. Blackwood was not finished. "You seem very interested in this piano, Margaret. Why is that?" Margaret's heart was beating so fast she could hardly speak. "It's just very beautiful, ma'am." "Beautiful, yes. And very expensive. And very precious to this family." Mrs. Blackwood walked around Margaret, looking at her carefully. "Tell me, Margaret, do you know anything about pianos?" Margaret hesitated. She wanted to tell the truth, but she was afraid. "A little, ma'am." "A little?" Mrs. Blackwood's voice was dangerous now. "What does that mean exactly?" Margaret took a deep breath. "I had some piano lessons when I was young." Mrs. Blackwood laughed, but it was not a nice laugh. "Piano lessons? How amusing. And I suppose you think that makes you qualified to touch my husband's piano?" "No, ma'am. I know it doesn't. Good. Because this piano is worth more than you will earn in 10 years. It is not a toy for someone like you to play with. Margaret felt hurt by these words, but she tried not to show it. I understand, ma'am. But Mrs. Blackwood was just getting started. Her voice became colder and more cruel. You know, Margaret, I think you may have gotten some ideas above your station. You've been working here for almost a month now, and maybe you've forgotten what you are. Ma'am, you are the housekeeper. You are the help. You clean toilets and wash dishes. That is your place in this house. You are not a member of this family. You are not a guest. You are certainly not someone who should be touching expensive musical instruments. Each word hit Margaret like a slap. She wanted to run away, but she needed this job. I won't touch the piano again, Margaret said quietly. Oh, but now I'm curious, Mrs. Blackwood said with a mean smile. You said you had piano lessons. Why don't you show me what you learned? Margaret's eyes got wide. What? Play something. Since you're so interested in this piano, let's see what your little knowledge can do. This was the moment Margaret had dreamed about, but not like this. Not with Mrs. Blackwood standing there ready to make fun of her. I couldn't, ma'am. It's too valuable for me to touch. Nonsense. I'm giving you permission. Go ahead. Play your little song. Margaret looked at the piano and then at Mrs. Blackwood's cruel smile. She knew this was a trap. If she played badly, Mrs. Blackwood would laugh at her. If she played well, Mrs. Blackwood would be angry that the housekeeper had hidden talents. I'm waiting, Mrs. Blackwood said impatiently. Margaret's hands were shaking as she sat down at the piano bench. She lifted the white cloth and looked at the keys. They looked different now, with Mrs. Blackwood watching. Not magical anymore, but scary. Margaret placed her fingers on the keys and tried to think of something simple to play. She started with a basic song she had learned as a child, but her hands were shaking so much that she hit wrong notes. The music sounded terrible. Mrs. Blackwood clapped her hands sarcastically. Wonderful. Such talent. Such skill. Margaret tried to continue playing, but she kept making mistakes. The more Mrs. Blackwood laughed, the worse she played. Stop, stop, Mrs. Blackwood said, still laughing. I can't listen to any more of this noise. You're hurting my ears. Margaret lifted her hands from the keys. She wanted to cry. So this is what you learned in your piano lessons? Mrs. Blackwood asked. My 6-year-old nephew plays better than that. I'm sorry, Margaret whispered. I'm out of practice. Out of practice? My dear girl, that wasn't being out of practice. That was never having any talent to begin with. Mrs. Blackwood looked very pleased with herself. Did you really think you could play this piano? This instrument that my husband, a real musician, played every day? Margaret stood up from the piano bench. Her legs felt weak. Let me tell you something, Margaret, Mrs. Blackwood continued. At my dinner party last week, I said that any woman who could truly play this piano would be worthy of my son. My friends and I were having a sophisticated conversation about music and culture, things that are far above your understanding. Margaret remembered that dinner party very well. She had served the wine and heard every word. Do you know why I said that? Mrs. Blackwood asked. Because I knew it was impossible. Real piano playing, the kind I was talking about, requires years of training and natural talent. It requires education and culture. It requires breeding. Mrs. Blackwood walked close to Margaret and looked her in the eyes. You don't have any of those things. You're a working-class girl who had a few piano lessons and thinks that makes her special. But it doesn't. You are what you are, and you always will be. At that moment, Christopher appeared in the doorway. He had heard voices and come to see what was happening. Mother, what's going on here? He asked. Oh, Christopher, perfect timing. Your housekeeper has been entertaining me with her piano skills. Mrs. Blackwood's voice was full of fake sweetness. Would you like to hear her play? Christopher looked at Margaret's red face and understood immediately what had happened. That's not necessary, Mother. But I insist. Margaret was just showing me how she learned to play piano as a child. Go ahead, Margaret. Play that lovely song again for Christopher. Margaret shook her head. Please, I'd rather not. Don't be modest, Mrs. Blackwood said. Play. Christopher stepped forward. Mother, I think that's enough. Margaret has work to do. Mrs. Blackwood looked surprised. Christopher had never defended the help before. "Fine," she said coldly. "But Margaret, I hope this has taught you a lesson about your place in this house. No more touching things that don't belong to you." "Yes, ma'am," Margaret said quietly. "You may go to your room now, and tomorrow I expect you to focus on your real job, cleaning and cooking, not dreaming about being something you're not." Margaret walked slowly toward the stairs. As she passed Christopher, he gave her a look that seemed to say he was sorry, but that only made her feel worse. In her small room, Margaret sat on her bed and finally let herself cry. Mrs. Blackwood had been so cruel, so mean. She had made Margaret feel small and worthless. But the worst part was that Mrs. Blackwood was right about some things. Margaret was just the housekeeper. She didn't belong in a house like this, touching expensive pianos and dreaming impossible dreams. Margaret wiped her tears and tried to forget about the piano. Tomorrow she would go back to cleaning and cooking. She would remember her place and not reach for things that were too high for her to touch. The next morning, Margaret woke up with red, swollen eyes. She had cried herself to sleep after Mrs. Blackwood's cruel words. Looking in her small mirror, she tried to make herself look normal. She couldn't let anyone see how much she was hurting. Margaret went downstairs to start her work. She avoided looking at the piano as she walked through the main hall. Mrs. Blackwood was having breakfast in the dining room and did not speak to her. Christopher was reading a newspaper and drinking coffee. "Good morning, Margaret," Christopher said kindly when she brought him fresh coffee. "Good morning, sir," Margaret replied quietly, not meeting his eyes. Christopher watched Margaret work all morning. He could see that she was sad and quiet, even more than usual. He remembered the beautiful music he had heard her play just 2 nights ago. He couldn't understand how the same person who played so magnificently could sound so awful in front of his mother. That afternoon, Christopher found Margaret in the library, dusting books. She was alone and he decided it was time to talk to her. "Margaret, may I speak with you for a moment?" Margaret looked nervous. "Yes, sir. Is something wrong?" "Please sit down." Christopher pointed to a chair near the window. "And please call me Christopher, not sir." Margaret sat down carefully, still holding her dust cloth. "Is this about last night? I promise I won't touch the piano again." Christopher sat in the chair across from her. "Actually, it is about last night, but not in the way you think." Margaret looked confused. "Margaret, I need to ask you something, and I hope you'll be honest with me." Christopher leaned forward. "Can you really play piano?" Margaret's heart started beating fast. "What do you mean? I mean, can you really play? Not the way you played last night for my mother, but really play." Margaret was quiet for a long time. She looked out the window at the gardens. Finally, she spoke in a very soft voice. "Why are you asking me this?" Christopher took a deep breath. "Because I heard you playing Wednesday night when everyone thought the house was empty. I came home early from my trip." Margaret's face went white. "You heard me?" "Yes. And it was the most beautiful piano playing I've ever heard in my life." Margaret started to cry. Not the sad crying from last night, but tears of relief. Someone had heard her real playing. Someone knew she wasn't just pretending. "Please, don't tell your mother," Margaret said through her tears. "She'll fire me if she knows I used the piano when she was away." "I won't tell her. But Margaret, I need to understand. If you can play like that, why did you sound so awful last night?" Margaret wiped her eyes with her handkerchief. "I was scared. She was standing there waiting for me to fail. She wanted to make fun of me. My hands were shaking so hard I couldn't play properly." Christopher nodded. "I thought that might be it. But Margaret, where did you learn to play so well? You're not just good, you're amazing. That level of skill takes years of training." Margaret looked at Christopher's kind face. She could see that he really wanted to understand. For so long, she had kept her past secret. Maybe it was time to tell someone the truth. "I studied piano for 23 years, she said quietly. Christopher's eyes got wide. 23 years? "I started when I was 5 years old. My father was a music teacher at a small college. He recognized that I had talent and found ways to pay for lessons with the best teachers. Margaret's voice became stronger as she talked about her past. When I was 12, I won my first piano competition. By the time I was in high school, I was winning competitions all over the state. I got a full scholarship to study music at the conservatory. A conservatory? Christopher couldn't hide his amazement. Which one? The Harrison Conservatory. I studied there for 4 years and got my degree in piano performance. After that, I got accepted to do graduate studies with Professor Elena Volkov. Christopher knew that name. Professor Volkov was world famous. Only the best students were accepted to study with her. I was going to be a concert pianist, Margaret continued. I had already started performing with orchestras. I had won several national competitions. My future was all planned out. What happened? Christopher asked gently. Margaret's face became sad again. Everything fell apart when I was 26. My father got very sick with cancer. The medical bills were enormous. My mother had to quit her job to take care of him. I used all my savings to help pay for his treatment. She paused and took a shaky breath. Then my father died, and we discovered he had borrowed money against the house to pay for my music education. The bank was going to take our home. My mother would have had nowhere to live. Christopher listened quietly, his heart breaking for Margaret. I had to make a choice, Margaret said. I could continue my music career and let my mother lose her home, or I could give up music and work to save the house. You chose your mother. I chose my mother. I got a job in an office and worked 2 other part-time jobs at night. I sent every penny home to pay the bank loan. It took me 3 years to save the house. And your mother? She died 2 years ago. A heart attack. Margaret's voice was very quiet now. After she died, I realized I had been away from music for so long that my career was over. I was 31 years old. In the music world, that's too old to start over. Christopher was quiet for a moment. So you started working as a housekeeper. I tried to get a job teaching piano, but I had been out of the music world for too long. No one remembered me. The few jobs I could get didn't pay enough to live on. I needed work that gave me a place to live and regular pay. But you still have your talent. What I heard Wednesday night proved that. Margaret smiled sadly. Talent isn't enough. In the music world, you need connections, opportunities, and luck. I had all of those once, but I lost them when I had to leave. Do you regret your choice? Margaret thought about this carefully. No. I don't regret saving my mother's house. She raised me alone after my father died when I was young. She worked 2 jobs to pay for my music lessons. I couldn't let her become homeless. But you must miss performing. Every day. Music was my whole life for so many years. When I stopped playing, it was like losing a part of myself. Margaret looked at Christopher. That's why I couldn't resist playing Wednesday night. It had been 3 years since I had touched a piano. I just wanted to remember who I used to be. Christopher stood up and walked to the window. He was trying to understand everything Margaret had told him. Margaret, do you know what my mother said at her dinner party last week? Margaret nodded. I heard her. She said any woman who could truly play your father's piano would be worthy of marrying you. She said it as a joke because she thought it was impossible. But you could play that piano beautifully. You already did. Margaret shook her head. But I'm the housekeeper. Your mother would never accept someone like me, no matter how well I play piano. My mother cares about education and culture. You have more education than most of her friends. You studied at one of the best conservatories in the country. You trained with world-famous teachers. But Christopher, look at me now. I clean toilets and wash dishes. That's what your mother sees when she looks at me. Christopher turned back to Margaret. Then maybe it's time she saw who you really are. Margaret felt scared and excited at the same time. What do you mean? I mean, maybe you should show her your real talent. Not scared and shaking like last night, but playing the way you played Wednesday night. She would never give me another chance. She made it very clear that I'm not good enough. Christopher smiled. Leave that to me. My mother may be stubborn, but she's also proud. If I can make her believe that her challenge was real, She'll have to honor it. Margaret looked at the young man who was being so kind to her. He believed in her talent. He thought she was worthy of respect. "Are you sure about this?" Margaret asked. "I'm sure. But Margaret, are you ready to show the world who you really are? Because once people hear you play, they'll know you're not just a housekeeper. You're an artist." Margaret thought about this. For years, she had hidden her past and tried to forget her dreams. Maybe it was time to be brave again. "Yes," she said, quietly. "I think I'm ready." Christopher smiled. "Good, because I have an idea that might change everything." Christopher's plan was simple but dangerous. He would tell his mother that someone had heard about her challenge from the dinner party. This mysterious person claimed to be able to play piano well enough to meet Mrs. Blackwood's test. His mother, being proud and unable to back down from her public promise, would have to agree to hear this person play. The dangerous part was that Christopher couldn't tell his mother who this person was until the last moment. If she knew it was Margaret, she would refuse immediately. "Are you sure this will work?" Margaret asked Christopher. They were talking quietly in the garden where no one could hear them. "My mother made that promise in front of 10 people, Christopher said. "Word has already spread through her social circle. If she refuses to honor her challenge now, people will say she was just making empty talk." Margaret felt nervous and excited. "But what if I can't play well when the time comes? What if I get scared again like I did with your mother?" "You won't," Christopher said with confidence. "Wednesday night you played from your heart. That's who you really are. Just remember that feeling." That evening at dinner, Christopher put his plan into action. "Mother, I heard something interesting today," he said casually as he ate his soup. "Oh? What was that?" Mrs. Blackwood was reading her mail while she ate. "Eleanor Morrison called me at the office. She said the most amusing thing." Mrs. Blackwood looked up. Eleanor was one of her closest friends and biggest gossips. "Apparently word of your piano challenge has been spreading around town," Christopher continued. "Eleanor said everyone is talking about it." Mrs. Blackwood looked pleased with herself. "I'm not surprised. It was rather clever of me." "Well, that's not the interesting part. Eleanor said that someone contacted her claiming to be able to meet your challenge." Mrs. Blackwood put down her fork. "What do you mean?" "Someone heard about what you said at the dinner party. They believe they can play Father's piano well enough to prove themselves worthy." Christopher tried to sound casual, but his heart was beating fast. "That's ridiculous," Mrs. Blackwood said with a laugh. "Who is this person?" "I don't know yet. Eleanor wouldn't tell me, but she said this person is quite confident about their abilities." Mrs. Blackwood thought about this. Margaret, serving dinner, listened carefully while trying to look like she wasn't paying attention. "Well, whoever it is will be disappointed," Mrs. Blackwood said finally. "I meant what I said, but I also know it's impossible." "So you would honor your promise?" Christopher asked. "If someone could really play that well?" Mrs. Blackwood's pride wouldn't let her say no. "Of course I would honor it. I'm a woman of my word, but it will never happen. What if we arranged a small gathering? Let this person try. When they fail, everyone will see that you were right about how rare real talent is." Mrs. Blackwood liked this idea. She enjoyed being proven right, especially in front of her friends. "That sounds amusing," she said. "Yes, let's do it. Eleanor can invite her friends and I'll invite mine. We'll have a little concert, and when this person makes a fool of themselves, everyone will understand what I meant about true talent." Christopher tried not to smile. His plan was working. "When should we do this?" he asked. "Next Saturday evening. That will give me time to invite the right people. I want witnesses when this person realizes they're not as good as they think they are." Margaret almost dropped the serving dish she was holding. Next Saturday was only 8 days away. Over the next few days, Mrs. Blackwood threw herself into planning the event. She invited 25 of her most important friends. She ordered special food from the best caterer in the city. She had the main hall cleaned until it sparkled. "This will be the social event of the month," she told Margaret as she arranged flowers. "Everyone wants to see who dares to claim they can play my husband's piano." Margaret spent the week practicing in secret. Early every morning, before anyone else was awake, She would sneak downstairs and play very quietly. She worked on the pieces she wanted to perform. Her fingers remembered everything, but she wanted to be perfect. Christopher helped by making sure Margaret had time to practice. He would distract James and Mrs. Patterson when Margaret needed to use the piano. He also found sheet music for some of the most beautiful and difficult pieces ever written. "Don't just play well," Christopher advised Margaret. "Play so beautifully that no one can deny your talent. Make them understand that they're hearing something special." As Saturday approached, Margaret felt more and more nervous. The whole plan depended on her playing perfectly in front of people who expected her to fail. Friday evening, Eleanor Morrison came for dinner to help Mrs. Blackwood prepare for the next day's event. "Victoria, I'm so excited about tomorrow," Eleanor said over dessert. "Have you met this mysterious pianist yet?" "No, and I don't need to," Mrs. Blackwood replied confidently. "I've heard enough amateur piano playing to know what to expect. This person probably took lessons as a child and thinks that makes them good enough for a Steinway Grand." "But what if they're actually talented?" Eleanor asked. Mrs. Blackwood laughed. "Eleanor, dear, real piano talent is incredibly rare. The kind of playing I'm talking about takes decades of training and natural gift. You don't just find that kind of ability in some ordinary person who heard about a dinner party conversation." Margaret, serving coffee, felt her hands shake slightly. Mrs. Blackwood had no idea how right she was about decades of training and natural gift. "Well, I've invited the Hartfords, the Washingtons, and the Carters," Eleanor said. "They're all very interested to hear this performance." "Good," said Mrs. Blackwood. "The more witnesses, the better. I want everyone to see that my standards are not impossible, just very high." Christopher joined the conversation. "Have you thought about what you'll do if this person actually can play well?" Both women laughed. "Christopher, darling, you're so optimistic," his mother said. "But don't worry, that won't happen." That night, Margaret lay in bed staring at the ceiling. Tomorrow evening, she would sit at the piano in front of 25 people who expected her to fail. They would be watching her, waiting for her to make mistakes, ready to laugh at her. But Margaret thought about her father, who had worked so hard to pay for her lessons. She thought about her mother, who had sacrificed so much for Margaret's dreams. She thought about all the teachers who had told her she had something special. Most of all, she thought about the music itself. The way it felt to create something beautiful with her hands and heart. The joy of making sounds that could move people to tears or make them smile. Margaret had been hiding for too long. Tomorrow night she would show everyone who she really was. She would play not just to prove Mrs. Blackwood wrong, but to honor the gift she had been given and the dreams she had once believed in. Saturday morning came bright and sunny. Mrs. Blackwood was in an excellent mood, excited about her evening of entertainment. Christopher was nervous, but trying not to show it. Margaret went about her work as usual, but inside, her heart was pounding. At 5 o'clock, Margaret went to her room to change clothes. Christopher had secretly bought her a beautiful black dress that was appropriate for a piano performance. When she looked in her mirror, she looked like a different person. She looked like the pianist she had once been. At 6:30, the guests began to arrive. Margaret could hear their voices and laughter from her room. They were excited to witness what they thought would be an amusing failure. At 7 o'clock, Christopher knocked on Margaret's door. "Are you ready?" he asked quietly. Margaret took a deep breath and nodded. "I'm ready. Remember, just play from your heart. Let them hear who you really are." Margaret walked downstairs with Christopher. At the bottom of the stairs, she could see the main hall filled with elegantly dressed people. The piano sat in the center of the room like a black jewel, waiting for her. It was time to show the world that dreams don't die. They just wait for the right moment to come alive again. Margaret stood at the top of the stairs looking down at the crowd of people in the main hall. Her heart was beating so hard she thought everyone might hear it. The guests were all talking and laughing, drinking wine and eating small appetizers. They had no idea that their evening was about to change completely. Mrs. Blackwood stood near the piano, holding a glass of champagne. She was wearing her best jewelry and looked very pleased with herself. She was clearly enjoying being the center of attention. Ladies and gentlemen, Mrs. Blackwood called out in a loud voice. Thank you all for coming to our little musical event. As you know, I made a challenge at my dinner party last week. I said that any woman who could truly master this piano would be worthy of marrying my son. The guests laughed and nodded. They remembered hearing about this from their friends. Well, someone has decided to accept that challenge, Mrs. Blackwood continued. Someone believes they have the skill to play this magnificent instrument like a true artist. Eleanor Morrison raised her glass. We're all very excited to hear this performance, Victoria. Indeed, said Mr. Hartford, an elderly man who owned several businesses. It should be quite entertaining. Margaret could hear the amusement in their voices. They were expecting to be entertained by someone's failure. They had come to watch someone embarrass themselves. Christopher appeared at the bottom of the stairs. He looked up at Margaret and gave her an encouraging nod. Then he walked to the center of the room. Before our pianist performs, Christopher said, I want to say something about music and talent. The room became quiet. Everyone was listening. My father loved this piano more than anything else he owned. He used to tell me that a truly great piano could only be played by someone with music in their soul. Not just technical skill, but real feeling. Christopher paused and looked around the room. Tonight I believe we're going to hear something very special. Something that will remind us all why music is one of the most beautiful gifts humans can share with each other. Mrs. Blackwood looked at her son with surprise. He was taking this much more seriously than she had expected. Christopher, dear, you're being very dramatic, she said with a small laugh. Let's just hear what this person can do and be done with. As Christopher smiled. Of course, Mother. Ladies and gentlemen, our pianist for this evening is Margaret Williams. For a moment, the room was completely silent. Then everyone started talking at once. Margaret Williams? Eleanor Morrison looked around the room. I don't know that name. Who is she? Asked Mrs. Carter. Mrs. Blackwood looked confused and annoyed. Christopher, I don't know anyone named Margaret Williams. Where is this woman? Christopher looked up the stairs where Margaret was standing. She's right here. All eyes turned to look up the stairs. Margaret took a deep breath and began walking down. Each step felt like it took forever. She could hear people whispering. She's very pretty. I've never seen her before. She looks nervous. When Margaret reached the bottom of the stairs, Mrs. Blackwood stared at her with growing recognition and horror. Christopher, Mrs. Blackwood said in a low, angry voice. This is our housekeeper. The room erupted in shocked whispers. Margaret could see the surprise and confusion on every face. What is the meaning of this? Mrs. Blackwood demanded. This is some kind of joke. Christopher stepped beside Margaret. No, Mother. This is very serious. Margaret has accepted your challenge. She believes she can play this piano well enough to meet your standards. Mrs. Blackwood's face turned red with anger and embarrassment. This is ridiculous. She's the help. She can barely play Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. Then you have nothing to worry about, Christopher said calmly. Let her try. When she fails, everyone will see that your challenge was fair and your standards are appropriate. Mrs. Blackwood was trapped. She had made her promise in front of all these people. If she refused now, she would look like a coward who didn't honor her word. Fine, she said through tight lips. Let her play. But when she embarrasses herself, I want her out of this house immediately. Margaret felt 25 pairs of eyes, watching her as she walked toward the piano. She could hear people whispering behind their hands. This should be interesting. Poor girl. She has no idea what she's gotten herself into. Victoria's going to destroy her. Margaret reached the piano and lifted the white cloth. The keys seemed to glow in the light from the chandelier. She sat down on the bench and adjusted her dress. The room became very quiet. Everyone was waiting to see what would happen. Margaret closed her eyes for a moment and thought about her father. She remembered him saying, Music isn't about impressing people, Margaret. It's about sharing what's in your heart. She opened her eyes, placed her fingers on the keys, and began to play. The first notes were soft and gentle, a melody from Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major. The sound that came from the piano was pure and beautiful. Margaret's fingers moved with perfect control and grace. The whispering in the room stopped immediately. Everyone was listening. As the Chopin piece developed, Margaret's playing became more confident and expressive. Her whole body moved with the music. Her fingers danced across the keys like she had been born to play this piano. Margaret could see the shock on people's faces. This was not what they had expected at all. When the Chopin ended, Margaret moved immediately into a piece by Rachmaninoff. This was much more difficult music that required incredible technical skill. Her hands flew across the keys, playing complex passages that most pianists struggled with. Mrs. Blackwood's mouth fell open. She had never heard anyone play so beautifully in her own home. The Rachmaninoff piece was powerful and dramatic. Margaret played with such emotion that several people in the audience felt tears in their eyes. This wasn't just skilled playing. This was art. When that piece ended, Margaret began something completely different. A jazz piece that showed off her ability to play different styles of music. Her fingers moved in ways that seemed impossible, creating complex rhythms and harmonies. The audience was completely captivated. No one was whispering now. No one was looking at their watches or thinking about leaving early. They were witnessing something extraordinary. Margaret played for 45 minutes without stopping. Classical, romantic, modern, jazz. She moved from style to style with ease. Each piece was more beautiful than the last. For her final piece, Margaret chose something that had special meaning for her. It was a composition by Liszt called Liebestraum, Love Dream. It was the most beautiful and romantic piece she knew. As the music filled the room, Margaret felt like she was flying. This was who she really was. Not the quiet housekeeper who cleaned toilets and served food. She was an artist. She was someone who could create beauty and share it with the world. The last notes of Liebestraum faded away slowly. Margaret lifted her hands from the keys and sat quietly for a moment. The room was completely silent. Then suddenly Mr. Hartford began to clap. Then Eleanor Morrison. Then everyone in the room was applauding loudly. Some people were standing up, some were crying. "Bravo!" shouted Mr. Carter. "Magnificent! I've never heard anything so beautiful," said Mrs. Washington. Margaret stood up from the piano bench and looked at the faces around her. They were all smiling and clapping. These people who had come to watch her fail were now cheering for her success. But the face Margaret looked for was Mrs. Blackwood's. The older woman stood frozen in place, staring at Margaret with complete shock and disbelief. Christopher walked to Margaret and took her hand. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said in a loud voice, "I present Margaret Williams, one of the finest pianists I have ever heard." The applause grew even louder. Eleanor Morrison walked over to Mrs. Blackwood, who was still standing like a statue. "Victoria," Eleanor said, "I believe you have some words to say." All eyes turned to Mrs. Blackwood. She looked at Margaret, then at her son, then at all her friends who were waiting to hear what she would say. Mrs. Blackwood had built her whole identity around being superior to other people. She had spent years looking down on people she considered beneath her. Now she was facing the truth that real worth had nothing to do with money or social class. The woman she had treated like a servant was more talented and educated than anyone in the room. The challenge she had made as a joke had been met by someone with extraordinary gifts. Mrs. Blackwood opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She was facing the most difficult moment of her life, and everyone was watching to see what she would do. The silence in the room felt like it lasted forever. Mrs. Blackwood stood frozen, staring at Margaret with her mouth slightly open. Everyone was waiting to see what she would say. The woman who always had sharp words ready was speechless. Margaret's heart was beating fast as she waited. She had played beautifully, better than she had ever played before, but she knew that her future depended on what Mrs. Blackwood said next. Eleanor Morrison stepped closer to her friend. "Victoria, you made a promise in front of all of us." Mrs. Blackwood blinked several times as if she was waking up from a dream. She looked around the room at all the faces watching her. These were her friends, her social circle, people whose respect she valued. Mrs. Blackwood started to speak, then stopped. She looked at Margaret again, really seeing her for the first time. This was not the simple housekeeper she thought she knew. The woman standing beside her son had just played piano like a master. Mrs. Blackwood had heard the best pianists in the world perform in concert halls. Margaret was as good as any of them. "Where did you learn to play like that?" Mrs. Blackwood asked quietly. Margaret lifted her chin and spoke in a clear voice. "I studied at the Harrison Conservatory for 4 years. I earned a degree in piano performance. After that, I studied with Professor Elena Volkov for 2 years." Gasps went up around the room. Everyone recognized those names. The Harrison Conservatory was one of the finest music schools in the world. Professor Volkov only accepted the most gifted students. "You studied with Elena Volkov?" Mr. Hartford asked in amazement. "My daughter tried to audition for her program. She said Professor Volkov only takes 2 or 3 students each year." "That's correct," Margaret said. "I was one of the few students accepted to study with her." Mrs. Carter shook her head in wonder. "But then why are you working as a housekeeper?" Margaret told her story simply and honestly. She explained about her father's illness, the medical bills, the choice she had made to save her mother's home. She talked about the years she had spent away from music, working to support her family. As Margaret spoke, the room became very quiet. These wealthy people began to understand what real sacrifice looked like. They saw that Margaret had given up her dreams to take care of the people she loved. "So you see," Margaret finished, "I am a housekeeper because life sometimes forces us to make difficult choices, but music will always be part of who I am." Christopher stepped forward and took Margaret's hand. "Mother, you said that any woman who could truly play Father's piano would be worthy of marrying me. Well, Margaret has played it more beautifully than anyone ever has." Mrs. Blackwood looked at her son's face. She could see something there that she had never seen before. Christopher was looking at Margaret with love and respect and admiration. "But Christopher," Mrs. Blackwood said weakly, She's what, Mother? She's educated at the finest schools? She's talented beyond measure? She's brave enough to sacrifice her own dreams for her family? She's kind and hardworking and honest?" Christopher's voice grew stronger as he spoke. "Or are you going to say she's not worthy because she's been working as our housekeeper? Because she's had to clean our house and cook our food to make a living?" The room was completely silent now. Everyone could feel that this was an important moment, not just for Margaret and Christopher, but for all of them. Mrs. Blackwood looked around at her friends. She saw Eleanor Morrison nodding with approval. She saw Mr. Hartford smiling at the young couple. She saw Mrs. Carter wiping tears from her eyes. These people, whose opinions mattered so much to Mrs. Blackwood, were clearly moved by Margaret's story and impressed by her talent. If Mrs. Blackwood rejected Margaret now, she would look small and mean in front of everyone she cared about. But more than that, Mrs. Blackwood was beginning to understand something about herself. She had spent so many years judging people by their money and social position that she had forgotten to look at their character and abilities. Margaret had more education than most of the women Mrs. Blackwood called friends. She had more talent than anyone in the room. She had shown more courage and loyalty to her family than anyone Mrs. Blackwood knew. And most importantly, Margaret had made Christopher happy in a way Mrs. Blackwood had never seen before. Mrs. Blackwood took a deep breath and walked slowly toward Margaret and Christopher. The whole room watched her every step. When she reached them, Mrs. Blackwood stopped and looked directly into Margaret's eyes. "Margaret," she said in a quiet voice, "I owe you an apology." Margaret felt tears starting in her eyes. "I have treated you badly because I judged you by your job instead of by who you are as a person. That was wrong of me." Mrs. Blackwood's voice grew stronger. "You are clearly a woman of extraordinary talent and education. More than that, you are a woman of character who sacrificed your own dreams to help your family. That shows the kind of heart that any mother would want for her son." The room erupted in applause. People were smiling and nodding with approval. But Mrs. Blackwood wasn't finished. She reached out and took Margaret's hands in hers. "I made a promise," she said in a voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "I said that any woman who could truly play my husband's piano would be worthy of marrying my son. You have played it more beautifully than I ever imagined possible." Mrs. Blackwood turned to face her guests. Ladies and gentlemen, I am proud to announce that I welcome Margaret Williams into our family. If my son chooses to marry her, she will have my complete blessing and support. The applause was thunderous now. Christopher swept Margaret into his arms and spun her around. She was laughing and crying at the same time. "Margaret," Christopher said, setting her down gently, "I fell in love with you the night I heard you, playing alone in this hall. Your music showed me your beautiful soul. Will you marry me?" Margaret looked into Christopher's kind eyes and saw her future there, a future where she could be herself completely, where her talent would be celebrated, not hidden, where she would be loved for who she really was. "Yes," she whispered through her tears. "Yes, I will marry you." The room exploded with cheers and applause. Eleanor Morrison was crying happy tears. Mr. Hartford was shaking hands with everyone near him. Mrs. Carter was already talking about wedding plans. Mrs. Blackwood watched the celebration with a mixture of emotions. She felt ashamed of how she had treated Margaret, but also proud that her son had found such a remarkable woman. She realized that her husband would have loved Margaret immediately. He always said that music revealed the truth about people's hearts. Over the next few weeks, news of the engagement spread throughout the city. People were fascinated by the story of the housekeeper who turned out to be a world-class pianist. Newspapers wrote articles about Margaret's background and her sacrifice for her family, but the most wonderful thing for Margaret was that she could play piano again. Christopher had the piano moved to a sunny room where Margaret could practice every day. The beautiful music filled the house once more, just as it had when Christopher's father was alive. Margaret also started teaching piano lessons to children whose families couldn't afford expensive teachers. She wanted to make sure that talent could be developed regardless of a family's money. It was her way of giving back and honoring her father's memory. Mrs. Blackwood surprised everyone, including herself, by becoming one of Margaret's strongest supporters. She helped Margaret organize charity concerts to raise money for music education. She introduced Margaret to important people in the music world who helped her get opportunities to perform again. "I was wrong about so many things," Mrs. Blackwood told Margaret one day as they planned a concert together. "I thought class and breeding were the most important qualities in a person, but you've shown me that character and talent matter much more." Margaret smiled. "We all make mistakes when we're afraid or don't understand something. What matters is that we learn and grow." The wedding took place 6 months later in the spring. It was held in the garden of the Blackwood mansion, with the piano moved outside so Margaret could play for her own wedding ceremony. She performed a piece she had composed herself, a beautiful melody that told the story of love overcoming all obstacles. As Margaret played, she thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had lost her first dreams, but she had found something even better. She had found love, acceptance, and the chance to share her gift with the world again. When the last note faded away, Christopher took her hand, and they were married under the spring sunshine, surrounded by people who had learned that true worth comes from the heart, not from money or position. After the ceremony, as guests danced and celebrated, Margaret and Christopher stood together by the piano. "Do you ever regret the path that brought you here?" Christopher asked. Margaret thought about all the pain and struggle of the past few years. Then she looked at her new husband and her new life. "No," she said softly. "Every difficult choice, every sacrifice, every moment of doubt led me to you, and to this moment. I wouldn't change any of it." Christopher kissed his bride gently. "My father always said this piano was magical. He said it would only sing for someone with music in their soul." "And what do you think?" Margaret asked with a smile. Christopher listened to the sound of laughter and music around them.